You are somewhere you have never been. A street in an unfamiliar town. A room in a building you entered 10 minutes ago. A corner of a garden belonging to someone you have only just met. Nothing significant is happening. Somebody says something ordinary. A door closes. The light falls across a wall in a particular way. And without warning, the whole scene locks into place, and you know it. Not vaguely, not in the way a place can resemble another place. You know this exact moment, with this exact arrangement of objects and sounds, in a way that feels like memory rather than resemblance. For 2 or 3 seconds, you have the sensation that you could say what comes next. Then it dissolves, and you are standing in an unfamiliar room again, slightly disoriented, with nothing to show for it. Most people have had this. Surveys carried out in many different countries consistently find that around 2/3 of respondents report having experienced it at least once, and a large number report it repeatedly. It happens to people of every background, every level of education, and every set of beliefs about how the world works. But the interesting part of déjà vu is not the familiarity. It is a second feature that is present almost every time, and that almost nobody thinks to examine. You know it is wrong. That is the strange thing. During the experience, you do not actually believe you have been there before. Part of your mind is producing an overwhelming signal of recognition, and at exactly the same time, another part of your mind is standing back and saying that this cannot be correct. The two states run in parallel, and the collision between them is what makes the experience so peculiar and so memorable. If it were simply a false memory, it would not feel unsettling. It would feel like remembering. What makes déjà vu remarkable is that it comes with its own built-in objection. Hold on to that detail, because it is the single most useful clue in the entire subject, and it points toward an answer that is stranger than either of the two explanations people usually argue about. The experience is old, and the arguments about it are older than most people assume. In the 4th century, before the Common Era, Plato recorded a conversation in which his teacher questions an uneducated young man about a problem in geometry. Through questioning alone, without being taught anything, the young man arrives at a correct solution. The conclusion drawn from this in the dialogue is that he was not learning at all. He was remembering, recovering knowledge his soul possessed before birth. That idea, that learning is a form of recollection from a previous existence, was already old when Plato wrote it down. It appears in the traditions associated with Pythagoras and in the religious movements of the ancient Greek world that taught the transmigration of souls. It appears independently, in more developed forms, in the religious traditions of India, where the movement of consciousness through successive lives is a foundational principle rather than a curiosity. So the past life reading of unexplained familiarity is not a modern invention or a piece of casual mysticism. It is one of the oldest philosophical positions humanity has produced, held seriously by sophisticated thinkers across multiple civilizations, and it is treated as established truth today by a very large portion of the world's population. It deserves to be examined properly rather than dismissed, and we will examine it properly. But first, we need to look at the phenomenon itself, because the research on it has produced findings that neither side of that old argument predicted. The scientific study of déjà vu began later than one might expect, and it began with a physician who thought the brain was two brains. In 1844, an English doctor named Arthur Wigan published a book arguing that the two halves of the brain are essentially independent organs, each capable of thought on its own. He proposed that the sensation of having lived a moment before occurs when the two halves fall briefly out of step, one registering the scene a fraction later than the other, so that the second arrival feels like a repetition of something already known. The specific mechanism was wrong, but the shape of the idea has proven surprisingly durable. Some form of timing error remains one of the recurring proposals in the field. The phenomenon received its modern name in France toward the end of the 19th century, when a physician presented a detailed case to a medical society, and the philosopher Émile Boirac used the term in his writings on unusual mental states. The French phrase, meaning already seen, entered international usage and never left it, which is itself unusual. Most languages have simply borrowed it rather than translating it. Then, for most of the 20th century, very little happened. Déjà vu sat awkwardly between disciplines. It was too brief to study, too subjective to measure, and impossible to produce on demand in a laboratory. Psychology largely left it alone. What eventually made it tractable came from two directions: from surveys and from patients with a particular neurological condition. Start with the surveys, because they produced the first genuine surprise. When researchers began systematically asking large numbers of people about their experiences, they found a set of correlations that are difficult to explain, and in one case, directly problematic for the past life interpretation. Déjà vu occurs most frequently in adolescence and early adulthood. Reports peak somewhere in the late teens and 20s, and then decline steadily with age. By the later decades of life, the experience becomes relatively uncommon. Consider why that is odd. Almost every other memory phenomenon moves in the opposite direction. Confusion about whether something happened, false recognition, difficulty distinguishing a real event from an imagined one. These become more frequent as people get older, not less. And under the past life reading, the pattern makes even less sense. If these moments were fragments surfacing from a previous existence, there is no obvious reason why they should be concentrated in youth and fade as a person accumulates more life to compare against. Other correlations point the same way. People who travel more report déjà vu more often, which is what you would expect if the experience depends on encountering new environments that partly resemble old ones. People who remember their dreams more vividly report it more often. It occurs more frequently during periods of fatigue and stress, and more frequently in the evening than in the morning. None of that resembles the profile of a message arriving from elsewhere. It closely resembles the profile of a memory system operating under load. But surveys can only take us so far. The decisive evidence came from medicine. For a long time, neurologists working with patients who experience seizures had noticed something in the descriptions those patients gave. In one form of epilepsy, seizure activity begins in a particular region of the brain located in the temporal lobe, on the side of the head above the ear. Patients with this condition frequently experience a warning period before a seizure, a set of sensations that arrive first and signal what is coming. Among the most commonly reported of these warning sensations is an intense feeling of familiarity, Patients describe it in almost exactly the words used by people describing ordinary déjà vu, except that it is often stronger, lasts longer, and arrives without any environmental trigger at all. That correlation immediately narrowed the search. Whatever produces this feeling, it is located somewhere in that region, and it can be set off by abnormal electrical activity. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, a Canadian neurosurgeon named Wilder Penfield established something more direct. Penfield was developing techniques for treating severe epilepsy surgically. Because brain tissue itself contains no pain receptors, this kind of surgery could be performed with the patient awake and able to speak, which allowed the surgeon to test the function of each area before deciding what could safely be removed. Penfield applied a small electrical current to points on the exposed surface and asked the patient what they experienced. Stimulating certain areas produced movement or tingling or sensations of sound. But when he stimulated parts of the temporal region, some patients reported something entirely different. They described vivid experiences, fragments of scenes, music, voices, and in a number of cases, the distinct sensation that the present moment was familiar, that this had happened before. An electrode, applied to a specific piece of tissue, could produce the feeling. Later research refined the location considerably. Work with patients who had electrodes implanted for medical monitoring allowed researchers to stimulate deeper structures with precision. And the results separated two things that ordinary experience keeps welded together. Stimulating one area, deep in the inner surface of the temporal lobe, tended to produce actual memories, specific scenes with content, which the patient could describe. Stimulating a neighboring area, part of the surrounding cortex, tended to produce something quite different, a powerful sense of familiarity with no content whatsoever, the feeling of knowing without anything being known. That distinction turns out to be fundamental to how memory works, and once it is understood, déjà vu stops being mysterious in mechanism, even if it remains extraordinary in experience. Human recognition operates through two separate processes. The first is recollection. You retrieve information, where you encountered something, when, what happened around it. Recollection has content and context. The second is familiarity. It is a fast signal that says, in effect, this has been encountered before. It carries no details at all. It is the feeling you get when you pass someone in the street and know you have met them, while being completely unable to say who they are, where from, or under what circumstances. We experience these as one thing, because in ordinary life, they arrive together. Familiarity fires, recollection supplies the details, and the whole package feels like a single act of remembering. But they are separate systems. They depend on different tissue, and either one can operate without the other. Now the explanation assembles itself. Déjà vu appears to be the familiarity signal firing when it should not, a strong recognition response, generated by a scene that has never actually been encountered. The recollection system, meanwhile, has nothing to offer. It searches, finds no matching event, and returns empty. This produces exactly the structure of the experience. Overwhelming certainty of having been here, complete inability to say when. And the sensation, reported by almost everyone, that the memory is just out of reach. Which it is not, because there is no memory. There is only the signal that one exists. That accounts for two of the three components. The third is the objection, and it is where the explanation becomes most revealing. Regions at the front of the brain are involved in monitoring, checking whether what the rest of the system is producing makes sense. This is the process that catches errors, notices inconsistencies, and flags when something does not add up. Under the current understanding, déjà vu is not only a false familiarity signal, it is a false familiarity signal that gets caught. The monitoring system detects the conflict between the strong recognition and the total absence of supporting evidence and raises an alarm. That alarm is the eerie quality, the sense that something has gone wrong, occurring simultaneously with the recognition itself. Which means déjà vu may be evidence of the brain working correctly rather than failing. The error is the false signal. The strangeness is the correction. There is an extraordinary piece of evidence for this, and it comes from cases where the correction stops happening. Researchers studying memory disorders have documented patients, generally older adults, with certain forms of neurological degeneration, who experience persistent and unshakable familiarity, and who no longer recognize it as false. The reported cases are striking. Patients have declined to watch television or read a newspaper on the grounds that they had already seen this particular program and read this particular article when they had not. Some have described meeting people for the first time and being certain they had met them before, and have become irritated when this was disputed. Some have reported the sensation covering nearly all of daily life, so that every event feels like a repetition of an event that already occurred. The condition has been described in the literature as a persistent form of the experience, and its defining feature is not the strength of the familiarity, but the loss of the objection. The signal is the same. What has failed is the system that normally says, "This cannot be right." That gives us something close to a controlled demonstration. Remove the monitoring, keep the familiarity, and a person stops having déjà vu and starts having a false belief about their own past, which suggests that in the healthy version, the objection is not incidental. It is half of the phenomenon. So the mechanism is reasonably well understood. But a mechanism is not a cause, and the obvious question remains. What makes the familiarity signal fire in the first place in an ordinary person standing in an ordinary room? Here, the research has produced its most elegant result, because someone finally worked out how to create the experience deliberately. The obstacle had always been the same. Déjà vu arrives unannounced, lasts a few seconds, and cannot be requested. You cannot study something in a laboratory if you cannot make it happen. The breakthrough came from thinking carefully about what kind of resemblance might be involved. If the familiarity signal is triggered by similarity to something previously encountered, then the similarity might not be to the objects in the scene. It might be to the arrangement of them, the spatial layout, the geometry of the space, the relationship between the walls and the openings in the furniture. That kind of similarity would be almost impossible to notice consciously. Nobody walks into a hotel lobby and thinks about how the configuration of pillars and seating compares with a museum entrance visited 4 years ago. But the brain processes spatial layout constantly and largely below awareness. Researchers led by the psychologist Anne Cleary tested this using virtual environments. Participants were shown a series of scenes. Later, they were shown new scenes that they had never encountered, but which had been constructed so that the spatial arrangement matched one of the earlier ones, while every visible object was different. A courtyard laid out like a previously seen bowling alley, a room whose geometry mirrored a garden. Participants reported déjà vu at significantly higher rates in those scenes. They had never seen the place. They could not identify what it reminded them of. But something in the configuration matched something stored, and the familiarity system responded to the match, while the recollection system, searching for a courtyard it had never visited, came back with nothing. That is the experience produced deliberately in a laboratory, with the source of the familiarity known to the experimenters and hidden from the participant. Related work has explored other kinds of hidden resemblance, and a separate proposal focuses on attention. The idea there is that a scene may be registered briefly while a person is distracted, a glance while looking at a phone, a moment of divided focus, and then perceived properly a second or two later. The second perception encounters a scene that was, in fact, already processed once, and produces a recognition response that has no accessible memory behind it, because the first glimpse never reached full awareness. Different researchers favor different accounts, and the honest position is that several mechanisms probably contribute. What they share is the same underlying structure, a genuine partial match occurring below the level of conscious awareness, producing a familiarity signal that consciousness cannot account for. And then Cleary's group tested the part of the experience that most people find hardest to explain away. Almost everyone who describes déjà vu mentions the feeling of knowing what will happen next. Not merely recognition of the present, but a sense of impending prediction that if the moment continued another second, you could say what the next sentence would be, where the next person would move. This is the feature that most often persuades people that something beyond ordinary memory is involved, and it deserved a proper test. The researchers put participants into the virtual environments, waited for déjà vu to be reported, and then paused the scene at a decision point and asked them to predict which way the path would turn. Participants reported a strong feeling that they knew the answer. Their actual accuracy was no better than chance. The feeling of impending prediction was real and was reported reliably. The predictive ability was not there at all. What the experiment appears to have captured is a sense of knowing that is generated by the familiarity signal itself. The mind, having decided that this situation is known, produces the expectation that the rest of it must be known too. That is a significant finding, because it addresses the strongest intuitive argument for something extraordinary happening. The premonition is part of the illusion rather than evidence against it. There is one more piece of evidence, and it comes from looking at the mirror image of the phenomenon. Déjà vu has an opposite, which occurs when something completely familiar suddenly feels alien. People experience it with words. You can produce it yourself. Take an ordinary word and write it or repeat it 30 or 40 times, attending to it closely. And at some point, it stops being a word. It becomes a shape or a noise, and the meaning drops away. And for a moment, you are not certain it is spelled correctly or that it is a real word at all. Researchers have induced this reliably in the laboratory using exactly that procedure. It also occurs with faces, with rooms, and occasionally with people's own homes. Put the two phenomena side by side, and something important becomes visible. The feeling that something is familiar is not a property of the thing. It is a signal produced by the brain and attached to experience. Normally, the signal is accurate, because normally it fires for things you have actually encountered. But it can fire when it should not, and it can fail to fire when it should. Which means the sense of recognition that accompanies nearly everything in your daily life, your kitchen, your route to work, your own reflection, is not a direct perception of the past. It is a continuously generated judgment running underneath awareness, which you almost never notice because it is almost always right. Déjà vu is one of the rare moments when it becomes visible. There is a related explanation that many people arrive at on their own, and it deserves its own examination because it is the most common folk theory in existence. You dreamed it. The reasoning is intuitive. Dreams are constructed from the same material as waking life: rooms, faces, conversations, ordinary situations. And they are forgotten almost immediately unless something fixes them. If a dream produced a scene resembling one you later encounter, the encounter might trigger recognition of a source you have no conscious access to. This is not an unreasonable idea, and it fits neatly with the finding that people who recall their dreams more often also report déjà vu more often. It also fits the fact that we forget the overwhelming majority of our dreams within minutes of waking, leaving an enormous body of experienced material that could produce familiarity without any retrievable origin. The difficulty is that it cannot be tested. A dream you do not remember leaves no record, which means the explanation can be offered for any instance and refuted for none. In research terms, that is a weakness rather than a strength, however plausible it may sound. It is best regarded as a possible additional source of hidden resemblance rather than a separate mechanism. The structure remains the same. Something partially matches, the matching is inaccessible, and the familiarity signal fires without its supporting evidence. It is also worth knowing that this experience belongs to a family, alongside the sensation of having already seen something, and its opposite in which the familiar turns strange. There is the frustrating state of having something almost within reach, a name, a word, a fact, that you are certain you know and cannot produce. Researchers treat these as related phenomena because each one involves the same underlying separation, the signal that information exists, arriving without the information itself. In each case, the mind is reporting on its own contents and getting the report slightly wrong. Now to the question in the title, which deserves a serious answer rather than a dismissal. Is any of this evidence of a previous life? Begin by acknowledging what is actually at stake. Reincarnation is a central belief for a substantial portion of humanity, held within religious traditions that have developed it with enormous philosophical sophistication over thousands of years. Surveys in Europe and North America have repeatedly found that somewhere between a quarter and a third of respondents express some belief in it, including many who do not belong to traditions that teach it. This is not a fringe idea, and treating it as one would be both inaccurate and disrespectful. There is also a body of research that has attempted to investigate related claims empirically, and it should be described accurately. For several decades, beginning in the 1960s, a psychiatrist named Ian Stevenson at an American university investigated cases of young children who spontaneously described what they said were memories of a previous life. His approach was to travel to the location, interview the child and family, attempt to identify the deceased person the child appeared to be describing and compare the child's statements with verifiable facts about that person's life. He accumulated case files numbering in the thousands, and his work has been continued by colleagues at the same institution. Some of the reported cases involve details that are difficult to account for, and Stevenson's collection is far more careful than the popular treatment of the subject would suggest. He was cautious in his conclusions, avoided sensational language, and published in academic form. The criticisms are also substantial and must be stated. The cases cluster heavily in cultures where reincarnation is a widely held belief, which raises the question of whether the framework shapes how a child's statements are interpreted and encouraged by adults around them. Investigations frequently took place after the family had already identified a supposed previous personality, meaning the crucial period before the two families made contact was reconstructed from testimony rather than observed. Much of the work depended on interpreters, introducing a layer between the researcher and the exact words used. And young children are highly responsive to the interest of adults, which is a well-documented complication in any research relying on children's statements. Where that leaves the field is a matter of genuine dispute among people who have examined it seriously, and it would be dishonest to declare the question closed in either direction. But here is the point that matters for this particular subject, and it is one that reincarnation researchers themselves have generally acknowledged. Déjà vu is not the same category of claim, and it is not offered as evidence within that research. The reason is the absence of content. A memory of a previous existence, if such a thing occurred, would have to contain something. A name, a place, a language, a face, an event, a piece of information that could in principle be checked against the world. That is precisely what the children in those investigations were reported to produce, and it is why the cases could be examined at all. Déjà vu contains nothing. It has no name attached, no location, no century, no person. It never involves an unfamiliar language or an unfamiliar object. The scene is always the scene in front of you, in your own time, in your own life, with your own clothes and your own companions. And that last point is worth pressing because it undermines the interpretation more thoroughly than any laboratory result. If the sensation were a fragment surfacing from another existence, one would expect the recognized scene to belong to that existence. Instead, people invariably report recognizing the present moment. This room, this conversation, this particular phone in this particular hand. Objects that could not have existed in any earlier life are included in the recognition without difficulty. Whatever is happening, it is happening to the present, not arriving from the past. There is a further explanation worth naming, because it accounts for a related set of experiences that people frequently describe alongside déjà vu, and it is often overlooked. The human memory system separates two things imperfectly: the content of a memory and its source. You can retain a piece of information for decades while completely losing the record of where it came from. This is ordinary and constant. Most of what you know, you cannot trace. When source information is lost but content is retained, the content can later resurface feeling entirely original, or feeling like knowledge that arrived from nowhere. This has produced some notable episodes. In the middle of the 20th century, a case attracted international attention in which a woman under hypnosis described in extensive detail a life in 19th century Ireland. including names, places, and customs. It became a publishing sensation and helped popularize the idea of hypnotic recovery of past lives. Subsequent investigation into her early life identified plausible ordinary sources for a considerable amount of the material, including a neighbor from her childhood with a strikingly similar name and an Irish background. The debate over how much was accounted for continued for years, and not everyone was satisfied by the explanation. But the case demonstrated something that has since been established thoroughly in memory research. Material absorbed and forgotten can return with complete conviction and no sense of its origin. That finding has considerable weight when applied to hypnotic regression specifically, which remains popular as a method for recovering supposed previous lives. Controlled research on memory and suggestion has demonstrated repeatedly that detailed, vivid, and emotionally convincing memories of events that never occurred can be produced in ordinary people through suggestive questioning. The people involved are not lying. They experience the memories as real, describe them in detail, and often become distressed when they are questioned. The vividness of a memory is not an indicator of its accuracy, and confidence is not either. Hypnosis increases suggestibility and reduces the critical filtering that normally accompanies recall. It is not a technique for retrieving buried records, and courts in many countries have restricted the use of hypnotically obtained testimony for exactly this reason. None of this proves that no one has ever lived before. It establishes something narrower: that the specific method most commonly used to demonstrate past lives is a method known to generate convincing content that did not happen. So where does that leave the question? The mechanism of déjà vu is well described. It can be triggered by electrical stimulation of specific tissue. It is associated with a particular neurological condition. It can be produced experimentally through hidden spatial resemblance. Its distribution across age, fatigue, travel, and stress fits a memory system explanation and fits nothing else particularly well. Its predictive feeling has been tested and does not predict, and its opposite can be induced in anyone with a pen and a repeated word. That is an unusually complete account for a phenomenon this subjective. What science has not done and cannot do from this material is settle the larger metaphysical question. Whether consciousness exists before birth is not a question a laboratory can address. And the fact that déjà vu has a good physical explanation says nothing about it in either direction. People who hold that belief on religious or philosophical grounds are not relying on déjà vu for it, and never were. The honest summary is that this particular experience has an explanation, and that the explanation leaves the deeper question exactly where it was. Which brings us to what déjà vu actually tells us, and it is more unsettling than a past life would be. We assume that experience is delivered to us, that we perceive a room, recognize it, and know where we are, and that these are simple facts about the world reaching us through our senses. What the study of this phenomenon reveals is that the components of that experience are manufactured separately and then combined. The image of the room is one process. The judgment that the room is familiar is another. The sense that the familiarity is justified is a third. The feeling that you know what comes next is a fourth. Ordinarily, they arrive together in perfect agreement, and the seamlessness convinces us that we are simply seeing what is there. Déjà vu is the moment the components briefly disagree. For 2 or 3 seconds, the recognition system says one thing, and the memory system says another, and the monitoring system announces the contradiction, and you experience the ordinary construction of reality with one of its joints visible. That is why the sensation is so hard to describe afterwards. There is nothing wrong with the room. What is exposed is a piece of your own apparatus. And consider what this implies about the rest of experience. The certainty you feel at this moment that you are yourself, that your memories are yours, that the room around you is the one you have always been in. That certainty is not perception. It is a judgment, produced continuously by systems that operate below awareness and that are usually accurate. Usually. There is one more thing worth saying. For anyone who finds this reduction disappointing, the past life explanation is beautiful, and there is a reason it has appealed to serious philosophers for 2,500 years. It offers continuity. It suggests that a person is not a single brief episode, but a thread running through many. It makes the strange familiarity a form of homecoming. The mechanical explanation offers something different, and it is not smaller. It says that inside your skull is a system that recognizes the shape of a space in a fraction of a second, compares it against everything you have ever seen without troubling you with the process, and reports its conclusions so smoothly that you mistake the report for direct contact with the world. And that occasionally, when the system misfires and its own supervisor catches the error, you get to feel the machinery move. Most people go their whole lives without noticing that any of this is happening. Déjà vu is the 2 seconds when you do. It is not a message from a life you have forgotten. It is a glimpse of the one you are having right now, seen briefly from the inside of the process that assembles it.